700 years separate the fall of Rome from China's first documented use of gunpowder. And that gap was not inevitable, not accidental, and not a simple failure of Roman science. At its peak, the Roman Empire controlled the trade routes, the raw materials, the literate scholarly class, and the military incentive to discover exactly this kind of weapon. The legions that lost the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD were defeated by Gothic cavalry that early Roman cannons could have stopped within the first 60 seconds of engagement. The divergence point is specific, the chain of consequences is traceable, and the end point is a world unrecognizable from the one that actually emerged from Rome's collapse. The single detail that makes this scenario genuinely terrifying is the one most alternate history accounts skip entirely. 7 centuries of absence is not a footnote. It is the entire shape of the medieval world, the Crusades, the Black Death spread, the rise of Islam, the fall of Constantinople, all of it downstream of one missing formula. What you're about to trace is not a story about Rome surviving. It's a story about what power does when it arrives 1,000 years too early. The question isn't whether a Roman alchemist could have found it. The question is what Rome would have become if one of them did. Rome didn't need a miracle to find gunpowder. It needed one man to combine what the empire already held. Roman engineers had been burning enemies with sulfur smoke since the siege of Ambracia in 189 BC, piping fumes through tunnels to collapse defenders from the inside. They knew saltpeter by another name, harvesting niter crusts from the cave floors of North Africa to cure leather and preserve meat across the legions. The incendiary arsenal Rome carried into every campaign already contained 2 of gunpowder's 3 ingredients, separated only by ignorance of what they could become together. Greek-speaking chemists in Alexandria were distilling pine resin into sticky fire compounds that clung to wood and flesh and wouldn't drown in water. The military demand for better siege weapons was constant. The raw materials were imperial property, and the infrastructure to experiment was already funded by the state. What Rome lacked wasn't chemistry. It was the specific, devastating question that forces chemistry into a new direction. Someone just had to ask what happened when the sulfur, the niter, and the charcoal from that forge all met inside a sealed space. Alexandria in 150 AD was the closest thing the ancient world had to a research institution. And one man working there was about to stumble into something the empire wasn't ready for. His name is lost, but his craft isn't. He was a metallurgist, trained in the Greek tradition, experimenting with sulfur compounds to refine bronze alloys in the furnace heat. Sulfur he had in abundance. Charcoal fed his fire, and saltpeter, harvested from the dry cave walls of the Egyptian desert, sat in an open jar beside his workbench. These 3 ingredients had never shared a crucible before. Not in any workshop from Londinium to Antioch, not in any formula passed down through the guild. Then one afternoon, the proportions aligned by accident, and the jar didn't just burn, it detonated. The workshop wall cracked. His assistant fled into the street, and the alchemist stood in the smoke, hands shaking, staring at something that had no name yet in Latin or Greek. What he did next would determine whether that discovery died in that room or walked out of it. A formula written in a scholar's notebook meant nothing until the right eyes found it. In Alexandria, knowledge had a well-worn path. From private workshop to wealthy patron, from patron to the imperial court in Rome. where useful things were rewarded and useless ones were quietly forgotten. The Roman military machine didn't wait for ideas to arrive. It sent men to find them, officers whose entire job was identifying any advantage that could be turned against an enemy. A substance that burned without water, that could be packed and detonated on command. That wasn't philosophy, that was logistics. A senior legate reviewing the Alchemist's notes wouldn't have needed to understand the chemistry to understand the consequence. He would have seen a siege wall and then the wall gone. Imperial sponsorship moved fast when the prize was military, because the empire's borders were always bleeding somewhere, and every general knew that the next barbarian coalition was already forming beyond the Rhine. The formula wouldn't stay in Alexandria long. It would travel west under armed escort toward the engineers who could turn a discovery into a weapon. The powder existed, but powder alone is just a curiosity sitting in a clay jar. What the Roman military mind demanded next was a vessel strong enough to survive the explosion it was meant to unleash. Bronze was the first instinct, the same metal that had cast temple bells and warship rams for centuries. But bronze cracked under repeated firing, splitting along the seams like a pomegranate left in the sun. Iron was the answer, thick-walled and brutal, bored by hand through weeks of grinding labor in the Legion's own fabrique. The first projectiles were rounded river stones, shaped on a lathe to fit the bore with just enough clearance to let the gas push rather than leak. Early tests destroyed the weapon before it destroyed the target, and at least one test crew learned that lesson with their lives. Engineers adjusted the charge, shortened the barrel, and packed the touch hole with a slow fuse of treated linen cord. Then came the morning when the iron held. The stone left the tube at a velocity no Roman eye had ever tracked, and a timber wall 60 paces away simply ceased to exist. Every siege commander in the empire was about to become obsolete. The wall had always been the enemy's greatest advantage, and Rome had always known it. A fortified city could bleed a legion for months, draining grain, draining men, draining the empire's patience one slow week at a time. The cannon changed that arithmetic so completely it's almost difficult to absorb. What once took a season of trenches and starvation now took a single morning of concentrated fire. Commanders who had trained their entire careers on the geometry of circumvallation suddenly held a weapon that made circumvallation obsolete. The psychological effect on defenders was not just fear. It was the collapse of the one belief that had kept them alive, that stone walls were enough. Roman engineers learned quickly that you didn't need to breach every wall. You needed to breach one and let the sound of it do the rest. Supply lines that had stretched thin across months now snapped back to weeks, freeing legions to move with a speed the ancient world had never seen. The siege was no longer a slow siege. It was a demonstration. And once the open field replaced the fortress as the final test of war, everything the barbarian world believed about stopping Rome would have to be reconsidered. The real Battle of Adrianople lasted less than 2 hours, and it ended Rome's future. Emperor Valens led 40,000 men onto that Thracian plain, believing Gothic infantry would hold the center while his cavalry flanked them. What arrived instead was a Gothic cavalry force that nobody had accounted for, sweeping in from the hills and folding the Roman line like paper. Valens died somewhere in the rout, his body never found, and the empire never recovered its nerve. Now rewind that morning and place a battery of iron-throated thunder weapons at the Roman front. The Gothic horsemen crest the ridge, and begin their charge across open ground. Exactly the kind of ground these weapons were built to punish. The first volley doesn't just kill riders. It breaks the charge's momentum before it reaches Roman shields. Horses that survived Adrianople's real chaos now bolt from a sound they've never heard and cannot reason through. The Gothic infantry, already wavering, watches its cavalry dissolve into screaming animals and riderless flight. What follows isn't a battle, it's a pursuit. But a Rome that can stop the Goths at Adrianople still has to answer for the force that drove the Goths here in the first place. The Huns did not simply invade. They pushed every people in their path like a wave compressing against a wall. The Visigoths fled west because they had nowhere else to go. And Rome in our history was too fractured to hold the line against that pressure. But a Rome with gunpowder doesn't fracture. It calcifies into something harder and colder than the empire that came before. When Hunnic outriders probe the Danube crossings, they meet artillery emplacements and legions who no longer fear cavalry in open ground. The negotiation that follows isn't diplomacy. It's a Rome dictating terms to people who have no counter to a weapon they cannot understand. Attila's confederation, denied its western prize, turns its hunger eastward toward the Sassanid frontier and the steppes of Central Asia. The migration period, that great churning of peoples that seeded medieval Europe, simply doesn't happen on schedule. What fills that silence isn't peace. It's a Rome with no rival left to discipline its own ambitions, expanding into a world that can no longer push back. When the Huns shatter against Roman gunpowder and retreat into the steppe, something far more dangerous than a battle is won. Rome has no rival left who can threaten its borders. And that absence of threat is not peace. It's a blank permission slip. The legions don't disband when the enemy disappears. They look for new edges to push, new provinces to absorb, new peoples to fold into the machine. A Rome that cannot be checked from outside has only one force left that might restrain it: itself. History tells us how well that tends to work. Every senator who might have argued for restraint now argues from a position of total Roman dominance. And restraint sounds a great deal like weakness when you're winning. The empire doesn't just survive, it expands faster and further than any Roman general of the classical era could have dreamed. Carthage was a rival once. The Parthians held the east for centuries. The Germanic tribes bled Rome white across the Rhine. None of those breaks exist anymore. So ask yourself what an empire looks like when every check on its appetite has been removed. And the only thing standing between ambition and conquest is the ambition itself. The answer to that question is already moving east, carried on the backs of merchants who've noticed something strange about Roman trade caravans. Rome never kept a secret that traveled through a marketplace. The same caravans that carried silk west and silver east also carried something far more dangerous: knowledge. Within a generation of the legions fielding their first iron-throated cannons, Parthian merchants would have watched Roman siege engines reduce a fortified gate to splinters in under an hour. You don't witness that and ride home empty-handed. Parthian engineers were sophisticated, their court hungry for military advantage, and the formula, sulfur, charcoal, saltpeter, was not locked in a vault. It lived in the hands of foundry workers, in the smell of a workshop, in the questions a clever man asks when he sees the impossible happen. The Kushan Empire, sitting astride the mountain passes between Persia and India, would have been next. absorbing the knowledge the way it absorbed every trade good that moved through its territory. Arabia would follow, and with Arabia came access to the Indian Ocean routes that connected the known world to everything beyond it. But Rome unleashed on the Rhine and the Danube, it had now, quietly and inevitably, handed to every rival civilization within reach of a camel trail. Rome couldn't keep this secret, and it was foolish to think it ever could. Merchants who traveled the Silk Road carried more than silk. They carried observations, and one observant trader was all it took. Within a generation, Parthian engineers were reverse engineering Roman cannon barrels from the scorch marks left on captured siege walls. Kushans adapted the formula next, mixing it coarser, building lighter tubes that their cavalry could carry across the steppe. Each civilization that touched gunpowder didn't just copy Rome. It reinvented the weapon around its own geography, its own enemies, its own fears. Fortifications that had stood for centuries became obsolete inside a single decade, and every kingdom that couldn't afford the new artillery became prey for one that could. The Sassanid Persians built the first counter-battery doctrine, positioning their own guns to silence Roman cannons before infantry ever moved. What you're watching isn't one empire pulling ahead. It's every civilization lurching forward simultaneously, each one terrified the others are moving faster. The scale of destruction this unlocks doesn't belong to any single conqueror. It belongs to the race itself. And the race, once started, had no finish line. Only the question of what all that desperate innovation does to the world's forges, its mines, and the men who run them. Gunpowder doesn't stay a weapon for long. It becomes a question, and that question demands answers. To make it reliably, you need consistent saltpeter, and consistent saltpeter means systematic chemistry, not accident. Roman engineers who once calculated aqueduct gradients now calculate combustion ratios, and the discipline of one feeds directly into the other. Metallurgy follows, because a cannon that shatters its crew is worse than no cannon at all. And so iron quality stops being good enough and starts being precise. Mining expands to feed the furnaces, and expanded mining demands better pumps, better ventilation, and better tools to reach deeper seams. Each solution to each problem opens a door that history, in our timeline, left locked for another 1,000 years. You can feel the timeline bending under the weight of it. A civilization that was already the ancient world's greatest engineer suddenly has a reason to become its greatest scientist. The Romans didn't just adopt gunpowder. They built an entire industrial logic around it. And that logic has a momentum of its own. By the time the calendar reaches what we would call the year 800, the world this empire inhabits looks nothing like anything that should exist yet. By the year 700, the world outside this timeline's Rome is almost unrecognizable to anyone who knows real history. The legions never shattered against Gothic swords, because Gothic swords were never enough to matter against cannon fire. Persia negotiated rather than fought, and the Silk Road runs under Roman customs posts from Londinium to the edge of the Gobi. The civilizations that rose in Rome's historical absence, the great Islamic caliphates, the Byzantine rump state, the Frankish kingdoms, simply never found the vacuum they needed to breathe. Where you'd expect medieval fragmentation, there is instead a single administrative machine, older than any institution alive in our timeline and still expanding. Steam-driven grain mills already operate in a dozen provincial capitals, and the engineers who built them are employed by a state that has never once forgotten how to organize at continental scale. That is not a renaissance. It's something stranger, something colder, and something the history books in our world have no name for yet. Every siege won in hours is also a city that never had time to surrender. Populations inside those walls, the craftsmen, the scholars, the children, they don't negotiate their way out when the gate falls in a single morning. Rome's accelerated dominance doesn't just compress military history, it erases the communities that history would otherwise have absorbed slowly, imperfectly, but alive. Think about what the barbarian migrations actually carried with them. Gothic legal traditions, Germanic oral poetry, the decentralized governance structures that would eventually seed medieval Europe's political diversity. Rome's gunpowder legions don't just repel those migrations. They obliterate the cultures behind them before those cultures leave any record at all. The loss isn't only human bodies, though the body count alone should stop you cold. It's the loss of every idea, every language, every way of organizing a community that never got the centuries it needed to mature. Rome's collapse was catastrophic and brutal, and yet that collapse scattered seeds. Libraries carried east, scholars fleeing to monasteries, knowledge surviving in fragments across a dozen successor cultures. Accelerate Rome's power, and you don't just delay the fall, you remove the scattering entirely. One empire, one trajectory, one catastrophic single point of failure for everything humanity had built. 700 years is not an accident, it's a wall, and the wall was built from wreckage. When Rome fell, the trade networks that carried knowledge across continents collapsed with it, and the Silk Road became a corridor of competing kingdoms rather than a highway of shared discovery. Chinese alchemists had the formula by the 9th century, but the fractured medieval world had no mechanism to carry it westward with any speed. The monasteries that preserved learning were not laboratories, and the warlords who replaced emperors had no appetite for systematic military research. There was no institution large enough, no treasury deep enough, no ambition organized enough to compress that knowledge into a weapon on schedule. What filled those 700 years was fragmentation. And fragmentation, it turns out, was a kind of protection. The very chaos that feels like civilizational failure was also a throttle on how fast destruction could scale. You look at that gap now, and you don't see lost time. You see borrowed time, spent slowly, without anyone knowing the bill was coming. Every consequence traced in this story points toward one conclusion that most people miss entirely. Rome's survival wouldn't have given humanity a faster path to the modern world. It would have closed the door on that path forever. The scientific revolution didn't emerge from strength and order. It emerged from fragmentation, competition, and the desperate creativity of 100 rival states. The Enlightenment wasn't built on empire. It was built on the ruins of one, where no single power could silence every voice at once. A Rome that never fell would have been a Rome that never needed to question itself. And that is the detail that should stop you cold. What kind of world do you actually want? One where the strongest civilization wins? Or one where the collapse of the strongest civilization makes room for something better? The real timeline gave us gunpowder late, democracy slowly, and science painfully. But it gave us all three precisely because no single empire lived long enough to prevent them. Rome's fall wasn't history's greatest tragedy. It was history's most consequential accident, and we are still living inside its gift.